The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt dense and oppressive, almost as if the very walls were closing in on the occupants. The court was in session, and rows of spectators filled the gallery, whispering and shifting in their seats, eyes glued to the front. At the defendant's table stood a young man, his slight frame dwarfed by the large wooden desk in front of him. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his chin lifted just enough to show that he wasn't intimidated. Jalen Dawson, only 19, was facing charges of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges themselves were serious, but what was truly on trial wasn't just Jalen. It was something far deeper, something that would test the very fabric of the justice system. Judge Walter Grayson, an aging man with a permanent scowl etched on his face, glanced at Jalen with a mixture of disbelief and condescension. He adjusted his glasses, tapping his fingers lightly on the desk, letting the sound reverberate through the otherwise quiet courtroom. There was something in the way the judge regarded the defendant that hinted he wasn't just judging Jalen's case, but Jalen himself. Grayson leaned back in his chair and smirked, his voice dripping with dry amusement as he addressed the young defendant. "You think you're some kind of legal expert, don't you?" He sneered. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A ripple of laughter passed through the courtroom. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, flashed a brief, confident smile, as did the stenographer and the bailiff. Even some of the spectators chuckled under their breath. Jalen, however, remained stone-faced. He wasn't here to make jokes. He wasn't here to entertain. He had spent years preparing for this moment, though never in his wildest dreams did he expect to be on the wrong side of the law. Yet, here he was. Jalen didn't flinch. He had long since learned that the system wasn't designed for people like him. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years. From a young age, Jalen had absorbed the stories she brought home, the corruption, the shortcuts, the biases that plagued the legal system. She'd often talk about how prosecutors would cut corners, how judges would turn a blind eye, how defense attorneys barely tried to help their clients. Jalen wasn't just a product of his environment. He was a student of it. While other kids his age memorized sports stats or video game cheats, Jalen memorized case law. While his friends played mock video games, Jalen played mock trials, arguing cases in his head, practicing how he'd defend himself if he were ever in this very situation. But none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another troubled teen, a young man who had gotten caught in a bad situation. He wasn't interested in Jalen's knowledge or his years of preparation. "Let's make this quick," Grayson muttered, flipping open the case file, his eyes flicking over the documents. "I have a golf game at 2. More laughter followed, but Jalen wasn't smiling. He was watching, waiting. He knew Grayson had just made a mistake. He'd underestimated him. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, stood up with practiced confidence. He wore a crisply ironed suit, a perfectly knotted tie, and carried himself with an air of superiority. He knew this case inside and out, or so he thought. "Your Honor," Carrington began, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest." The prosecutor paused, letting the words sink in. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself. A murmur rippled through the gallery as the audience processed the damning details. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. On paper, the case seemed airtight. Jalen had been caught, and the evidence appeared to point directly at him. Grayson glanced at the young man standing before him, his expression unreadable. "Go on," the judge said, tapping his gavel lightly. Carrington walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the wooden floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding," he continued, "that Mr. Dawson is just some unfortunate victim of circumstance. But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened as Grayson leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on Jalen. The young defendant, however, didn't blink. He had studied every aspect of courtroom procedure, every tactic that a prosecutor like Carrington might use to sway the jury. He knew that the prosecution's case was based on assumptions, not facts. Carrington, sensing his momentum, flipped through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee." The prosecutor's voice was filled with authority. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book. Judge Grayson exhaled through his nose and nodded, turning to Jalen. "Sounds straightforward to me." For most of the room, it seemed that the case was sealed. A stolen car, a chase, a witness. It was as if everything lined up perfectly. But Jalen saw the cracks. He had spent too many years learning how to pick apart the lies, the half-truths, and the assumptions that often ran rampant in courtrooms. The system wasn't designed to work for people like him. But that was exactly why he had prepared for this moment. He wasn't going down without a fight. Grayson tapped his gavel again. Let's hear the defense's response. The defense attorney, Lisa Thornton, stood up nervously, her hands trembling as she adjusted her glasses. She hadn't spoken much during the proceedings, and now her voice was barely above a whisper. Your Honor, she began, my client. But before she could continue, Jalen placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to stop. The court went silent as he stood up. His gaze shifted to Grayson, and in a calm, controlled voice, Jalen said, I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The room fell into stunned silence. The audience murmured among themselves, some in disbelief, others in curiosity. Grayson, clearly amused, raised an eyebrow. You'll what? Jalen's voice was unwavering. I'll be defending myself. Carrington let out a sharp laugh, his posture shifting. This should be interesting, he said, trying to mask his growing discomfort. But no one was laughing now. Jalen stepped forward, his hands still in his pockets, his stance casual yet confident. It was as though he was standing on his own terms, and the courtroom had no choice but to watch. Your Honor, Jalen began, his voice measured but firm. Before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. Go ahead, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jalen didn't miss a beat. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Carrington exhaled sharply, clearly growing tired of the back and forth. That's right, and that testimony is written in his report. Jalen nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson squinted at him. On what grounds? Jalen's voice remained steady as he gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Jalen's words hung in the air as he took another step forward. If the officer's report says he witnessed me in the car, then it should match his GPS logs from that night. But I have a feeling it won't. The gallery's murmurs grew louder, and Grayson's brow furrowed as he glanced between Jalen and Carrington. The tension was palpable. Carrington hesitated, his confidence faltering. Your Honor, are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? He said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Jalen shrugged, his demeanor unfazed. If Officer Ruiz was where he claimed to be, then the GPS logs will confirm it. But if not, well, that's a different story. Grayson turned to Carrington, his expression unreadable. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington's hesitation was noticeable, and for a moment, Jalen knew he had the upper hand. If the prosecution was so confident in its case, why were they stalling? Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. No objections, Your Honor, Carrington muttered reluctantly, his voice clipped. The courtroom was silent now. The game had changed. Jalen wasn't finished yet. His next move would expose the true flaws in the case. As Carrington scrambled to maintain control, Jalen addressed the jury, his voice calm and steady. The prosecution wants you to believe that my fingerprints on the steering wheel mean I stole the car. But let's think about this logically, he said, pausing to let his words settle. He turned to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them. Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, and then put it back on the rack. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Does the fact that your fingerprints are on the jacket mean you stole it? Some jurors exchanged glances. The doubt was starting to creep in. Jalen continued, his tone firm. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. When we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, but I didn't take the car. I didn't steal anything. I didn't even drive it. Jalen turned to Grayson, his gaze unflinching. Does touching something make you a criminal, Your Honor? Carrington cleared his throat, his confidence beginning to crack. We still have the fingerprints, Your Honor, he said, but his words lacked conviction. Jalen pressed forward. And let's talk about that fingerprint analysis for a moment. He turned to Grayson. Was the forensic specialist subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. No, he muttered reluctantly. Jalen's lips pressed together. So, the prosecution wants to use forensic evidence to convict me, but they didn't think it was important to bring in the actual specialist who processed the evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine them? To ask about the chain of custody? To challenge the accuracy of the analysis? Carrington didn't respond. Jalen smiled. Interesting. The courtroom fell silent again as Grayson rubbed his temples, the weight of the case sinking in. He glanced at the jury, then turned back to Jalen. You may continue. Jalen knew this was his moment. He pulled out a printed transcript from his file and began reading aloud. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the Audi, provided a statement that was conveniently never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. Jalen held up the paper for everyone to see. The owner said, and I quote, "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A gasp spread through the courtroom. Jalen met Grayson's eyes. That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently ignored. Carrington stepped forward, scrambling to maintain his composure. "This is irrelevant, Your Honor," he said, but the desperation in his voice was clear. Jalen stood tall. "No, it's not. The arresting officer admitted that the real thief was white, but the police decided I fit the description. They arrested me, assuming I was guilty." The room was deathly quiet. Even Judge Grayson seemed to recognize the significance of what had just been said. Jalen turned to the jury. The real suspect got away that night, but instead of focusing on the truth, the officers found a black kid in the area and decided that was close enough. The words hung heavy in the room. Jalen had just shown them the true nature of the case, the bias, the assumptions, the shortcuts. And now, it was undeniable. Grayson exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple again. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" he asked. Carrington was stiff, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor," he muttered. Jalen's gaze didn't waver. "I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anyone." Judge Grayson let out a slow breath. "Case dismissed." The words reverberated through the room like a shockwave. Silence, then chaos. Some people in the courtroom erupted in disbelief, while others stood in quiet relief. Jalen remained motionless, letting the moment sink in. Grayson glanced at him, his expression unreadable, then said something that would stay with Jalen forever. "You should consider law school," the judge said, his tone almost wistful. Jalen didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He was already on his way. As he walked down the courthouse steps, reporters bombarded him with questions. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward. But Jalen wasn't interested. He had something more important. He had something more important to focus on. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Denise, was waiting for him. She crossed her arms, her face unreadable. For a moment, she just stared at him, and then finally, she spoke. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled softly. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She shook her head, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." Jalen smiled, but the cameras were no longer his concern. He had already made his point, and now he was going to change the game. As he left the courthouse, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd stand at a courtroom. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be alone. The courtroom may have blinked first, but Jalen Dawson had already set the wheels of change in motion.